The top of the hour, and today's webinar we're going to be looking at designing customer journeys. We've got three experts on customer journey mapping, and delighted to welcome them all to the webinar. In his first webinar with us, delighted to welcome Ian Williams from Jericho Consulting. Ian, welcome to the webinar.
Thank you very much.
And you've been designing sort of customer journeys, customer experience with consultants, with companies for a number of years.
Yeah, Jericho set up about 7.5 years ago. I came from the marketing world that transitioned into channel management, retention, and customer experience within the financial services space. But over the last 7.5 years, I've had the pleasure and the privilege to work in various different parts of the world: North America, Middle East, across Europe. Working in telecommunications, utilities, retail, so across a number of sectors that I've worked with.
Excellent. And we've got Maurice Pentle from the Customer Experience Foundation. Welcome back to another webinar with us. It's delightful to have you here. And the Customer Experience Foundation, what's the connection with customer journey mapping?
Well, I listened to what Ian said, and it did make me feel rather old. I did my first customer journey map, though it wasn't called customer journey mapping, for a group trying to impress Mrs. Thatcher in 1979, looking at the contact relationship between the citizen and the state, which was a huge project that never really went anywhere. But for us, customer journey mapping is an expression of the way in which experience is delivered, and customer experience, in the way that we think about it, is the overall discipline around behavior, technology, business process, organization, and culture. It's the overarching piece around that delivers an experience to all of your stakeholders, be they internal or external. They are all customers of the experience you deliver. So that's where it sits with us.
Excellent. Thank you, Maurice. Also delighted to welcome to our panel again Rachel Lane from Variant. Welcome, Rachel.
Thanks, John T. Good to be back.
And you've got run a consulting arm at Variant, and you've got a whole group of consultants running around doing customer journey maps, presumably as we speak.
We have. Yeah, we've been running quite hard this week, and that's why I'm out in Dubai at the moment. But yeah, I mean, I think when we're thinking about customer journey mapping, it's been a hot topic for the last 12 months. But I think what we're seeing now is as organisations start to mature in their programme, we're seeing areas where you know, they're either bringing in extra technology or they're bringing in new people to manage these programs. So we're really seeing probably more communication now than we ever have done before, and people just looking for processes within their methodologies that they're perhaps missing. So hopefully we're going to cover some of that today. Excellent.
Well, we're also going to be doing a replay of the webinar later on. That's at callcenterhelper.com/recorded webinars. We will be doing a lot of detail, so you may want to make a note of that address. We've got a chat room running alongside, and the hashtag #question for a question, #tip for a tip, and there is a bottle of champagne or box of chocolates for the best tip that anyone leaves. The details for the chat room here, callcenterhelper.com/chat is the address here. And once you're logged in, just you can go and download the webinar slides here. A lot of people do like to have the webinar on one side of the screen, the chat room on the other, so you can see both bits coming through. Does seem to be running a little bit slow overall. And we did ask a question earlier in the chat room about what some of the pain points are. And Fiona said one of the pain points is having to wait for callbacks on technical referrals. It's getting access to decision makers on some of that technical referral can take a while, and that's causing a bit of a pain point. I'm going to run a couple of polls now, and I'm going to ask you in the polling box, where are you with your customer journey mapping? So have you already mapped your customer journeys? Have you already got a project in progress? Are you thinking about mapping your customer journeys? or do you have no plans? So it'd be interesting to see where the maturity is on that. I know, Maurice, you were asking about maturity earlier today. Where do you think people's maturity is likely to be?
I think for most organizations, we're probably talking about somewhere between we're thinking about it and we have a project in process. I think from a practical point of view, and the numbers bear me out, most of the people who contact the foundation are asking about best practice and asking about ways to do it and what ought to be included in journey mapping. So I'd say that the poll kind of reflects my inbound mailbag, so to speak, in terms of where people are today.
So about 13% have already mapped out our customer journeys, which I think is probably a bit lower than I thought. 45% have a project in progress. I guess if there's a project in progress, you're more likely to come to a webinar. 37% are thinking about it, and 10% have no plans. Rachel, I think there's still quite a number there, 37%, 47%, who haven't yet got a customer journey mapping project. Does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me at all, and I would say, yeah, that's pretty bang on. I mean, I think, you know, even the fact that we've got 45% here that have a project in progress, yeah, that sounds about right. I'd be interested to know whereabouts, you know, they are in terms of that project. Are they reiterating that project? You know, but certainly in terms of those that are thinking about it, that's what's driving a lot of this hot topic. So the great thing for us, of course, is that, you know, everybody's relatively new to this, and, you know, nobody has a really mature program yet. So, you know, good opportunity from something like this is to learn from some experts that have actually worked with a number of different organisations and, you know, learnt those best practices along the way.
And we've got one other poll we're going to run, which I think will tie very much into what Ian's going to be talking with in a short while, which is if you have already mapped out the customer journey or you're in process of doing that, was the project for it led by the customer? Was it led by an expert? Was it led internally within the business? So if you'd just like to share your thoughts on that.
Can I give a quick description of those three things as well? Customer-led is where it's been led by research, so there's been specific research activity undertaken to be done it. Expert-led is where a consultant comes in and uses their skills. They might do things like mystery shopping and internal diagnostics in order to map out the journey. And business-led is often where you have the brown sheet of paper and the post-it notes on the wall and getting people in the room and making a decision about what they believe the customer journey to be like.
Right, okay, well we've got the results of that come back now, and here we are. We're seeing quite a strong internal focus on how this has gone about. 86% business-led, 17% expert-led, and 17% customer-led. Ian, I know you're going to be talking on this in a minute. Any surprises there for you?
Yeah, it is a bit of a surprise that so many are actually business-led, I think, because certainly from our experience, there is a danger when the business leads the customer journey mapping process that what they end up with is a process flow diagram rather than a customer journey map. Now, nothing wrong with the process flow diagram. It maps out the process of the business from end to end, but that very much reflects what the customer journey is. Now, I'm not saying that's the case with all business-led journey mapping exercises. Many of them may indeed be from the perspective of the customer, but led by the business. However, that can be one of the potential risks of certainly not having customers actively involved in the journey mapping process.
And I think there's also a danger that if it's business-led, you also get a sort of rather idealized process of how things could look rather than necessarily how it is. Maurice, you've got a point to make.
Well, there were 2 points. Firstly, I would encourage people to take all three approaches, as what you'll end up with is three very different views, potentially of the same elephant. And getting this stuff right is very important. I think Ian's point is absolutely vital, in as much as there's a huge difference between designing an experience around a process and designing a process around an experience.
Yeah.
And to get to the bottom of that is a big thing. And then my final concern is that I think 86% and 17% and 17% makes up more than 100% of our audience, and I'm slightly scared of that.
That's because multiple options were allowed on that poll, so you might more than one approach, so it will add up to more than 100. So there we are.
That's encouraging. Sorry.
I've certainly describing the customer journey as designing customer journey as an elephant, I think, is quite apt. So, so now to talk about the elephant in the room, I'm going to pass the baton across to Ian Williams from Jericho Consulting. And Ian, if you'd like to share with us some of your thoughts on the on how to build a customer journey map.
Absolutely, and I will also be jumping into a poll relatively early on within the presentation. Do I pass back over to you, John T, or do I drive that from the panel?
If you can drive it from your screen, hopefully you can just share your screen there.
Okay, not a problem. Yep, we're coming on now.
There we are. Just go full screen.
Okay. There we go.
Wonderful. Okay,
so everybody see that now?
We can indeed.
Okay. Designing customer journeys. Okay, so we've spoken. One of the first questions I'd like to ask is there are three different scopes to doing this. So baseline plus is having a look at the existing journey and saying, do we make an improvement to the existing journey? The second is baseline to ideal, which is where you map the existing journey, and then you might map an ideal journey, and then you say, okay, we'll try and close the gap between one and the other. The third approach is ideal only, which is future state journey mapping. Some people decide to start with a clean sheet of paper, various different motivations for doing that. But we've got a poll on these three different scopes, so it would be good if we could run that poll, John T.
Okay, we'll certainly run that poll now. We've got the questions slightly different in terms of the overall approach. We've got clean sheet, baseline plus, and baseline to future state, which I think ties in with the ones that you were talking about there, Ian. So if you just like to...
So baseline plus is existing journey and then making improvement to the existing journey. Baseline to future state is mapping current and future journeys and then working out how to close the gaps between the two. And then clean sheet is where you just say, okay, let's not worry about the existing journey. Let's create a clean piece of paper and see what we have.
Okay, and we're allowed to vote on more than one option here. Let's just share the results with everyone. Sample size here is 116. 27% say clean sheet, 40% baseline plus, and 46% baseline to future state. So quite a divergence there, Ian, in the way that people are designing their journey maps.
Quite encouraging, though. Typically, we see that baseline plus is the one that most people go for. However, if more people are doing the baseline to future state, I think it shows that possibly things have moved forward in that regard.
Excellent. Well, perhaps you'd like to carry on with your presentation and just pop that up on your screen, and then.
Okay, just 1 second. Right, do we have that back on screen again?
We do indeed.
Thank you. Right, so the second thing that we've already done the poll about is the customer-led, the expert-led, and the client-led. So I won't run through this, but fundamentally, customer-led is a VOC, a voice of the customer approach that uses qual to quant and analytics, and then future state journey mapping as well. And some people also have voice of the customer platforms as well that they use, things like Medallia, Confirm It, etc. Expert-led, mystery shopping, diagnostic, and potentially analysis of current data. And then client-led, which is the brown paper and post-it note exercise, possibly run with senior teams or frontline staff. We're going to be going into a bit more detail on these as we go through. So our preferred approach, as Maurice alluded to, it's best if you can combine combine various different approaches. Our preferred approach is doing the expert and customer-led, and then potentially on the back of that doing business-led in parallel, and then comparing the two different things. And as Morris said, you end up with different views of the same elephant. And sometimes you get two views of an elephant and one view of a snake. So it's very interesting that doing these different exercises, because often what you think the experience of the customer is and what the customer's experience actually is can be significantly different. Okay, so one of the things you need to take into consideration when you first start mapping your journeys is the level at which you want to look at the experience. Now, of course, there's an individual touch point, that's an individual interaction. Process level, which is a combination of touch points. Process, we don't mean the process of the organization, we mean the process that the customer goes through. The journey level, which is a combination of processes, and then there's also the life cycle level. So that's all the way through the life cycle of a customer. So if I was to use Tesco as an example for this, a touch point might be me speaking to somebody at the cashier at the cashier's desk. The process would be me paying for my shopping, so putting things on the conveyor belt and the cashier scanning them through, me chatting to the cashier and then bagging them up. The journey level is me going to Tesco's on a Saturday afternoon 3 weeks ago, and then the customer level, the life cycle level, is my relationship with Tesco's overall, with the brand. So often I haven't shopped with Tesco's for a number of years now, but I'm still within that life cycle because I'm sure at some point I will go back and have a relationship with them. So when we're mapping journeys, we have to ask ourselves, what level are we going to approach this at? Because there's arguments, depending on the level of detail that you want to go into, to approach all of these levels, or maybe just some of them. Not everybody has the same journey. The reason why we have a piece of orange on the screen is because we're talking about segments. However, in the customer experience world now, people are talking more about how do we develop segments into personas, and the importance around the persona argument is that personas bring segments within the organization to life. So one of the things that I know that Morris is going to come on to talk about, which is absolutely essential, is combining not just the functional experience of customers, but their emotional experience. And by building personas around your segments, it brings the emotional experiences of your customers to life. And clearly, if you have, I don't know, 5 different segments, 5 different personas, you might necessarily have to map 5 different journeys for each of those different personas as well. You also need to take into consideration your channels, which customers are going to interact with you at each particular touch point. I'm not going to go into detail because I think everybody gets this one. There needs to be consideration around the core metrics as well. So lots of people are now using NPS. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Customer satisfaction was a measure prior to NPS. NPS came along to almost like debunk CSAT because there was a view that CSAT wasn't sophisticated enough. But now you've got things like customer effort score, you've got things like NetEasy. Now, some people make the decision you've got to pick one metric. I would personally argue that you've got to pick the right metric for the organization, but also there's no reason why you can't use 3 or 4 different metrics at different points in the customer's journey. So recommendation is all about how happy you are with the product, which is all about what NPS is, and you might recommend buying a Porsche to your friend, but effort is more to do with going through something that creates a lot of effort. So there might be a product or service I buy where both of those particular metrics are applicable. So there's no reason why you can't use more than one core metric. So the steps that we would typically go through with journey mapping: first of all, establish a journey framework. Here's an example of a journey framework. So at the top we have what we call journey moments. They're different stages of the journey. The important thing is that this is not a process map, this is a journey map. And what we mean is it's looking from the outside in. So everything is written in the words of the customer. I'm thinking of joining, I'm using, I'm making a change. And then each of those different stages is broken down into a number of smaller steps as well. The reason why we do this is this provides us with a framework for the rest of the activity. So this is used when we run focus groups, this is used when we do voice of the customer activity, it's used when we do mystery shopping activity. It provides the framework for the entire project from end to end. And here's an example that the one that we did recently in the aviation sector with one of the airlines. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but the importance is that usually the customer's experience is more detailed than a process, and also, as I said before, it's outside in. The next thing we do is understand the existing customer journey. So there are 3 different approaches to this: mystery shopping, business diagnostics, and voice of the customer. So mystery shopping and business diagnostics, this is a combination. Often this is the expert-led approach, as we would call it. So if we can see this example here of going to a hotel, and this might be the journey that the customer goes through at the top of the top. But as well as that, you've got what the frontline staff are doing when interacting with the customer, but also what's happening in the background as well. And the process is the bottom half bit, and the journey is the top half bit, if you see what I mean. And if we want to do a diagnostic of this, then mystery shopping, we might walk in the shoes of the customer to go through the customer journey at the very top, and at the bottom we might do a business diagnostic. So mystery shopping's outside in, business diagnostics inside out. So walking the process end to end within the business that mirrors the customer's journey, but also looking at existing data within the organization, analyzing existing data to understand where the failure demand and where the value demand comes from within the business. And that can give you a pretty accurate understanding as to what the customer's experience currently is like. Combined with that, you can also use voice of the customer. So there are typically 4 steps: qual to quant and analytics, and then platform VOC I'll come on to a little bit later. So there are different things that we do as part of qual. We would do focus groups looking at functional and emotional expectations. So we would use that framework that I spoke about before. We would go through all the stages and phases and then say, okay, what are the functional and emotional expectations of the customer at each of those different stages? In addition to that, we do personification, and we do to the CEO. These last 2 things are things that you do during your focus group activity, but these activities are used more for leadership and cultural change programs as part of your overall customer experience transformation program. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about what those different things are, but people can ask me about them afterwards. Qual to quant, which is the second step in VOC, prioritizing customer expectations. So you might end up with 200 customer expectations. You can't meet every single customer's expectations. You have to focus on the most important ones. So grouping, filtering, and doing some kind of conjoint analysis workshop in order that you can go from maybe 200 expectations down to 25 expectations which are of the greatest relevance to the customer. And then when you've got those expectations, then the next thing you have to ask is, are those expectations, do they sit at a touch point level or do they sit at a relationship level? So here's an example of 25 expectations that came out of a piece of research that we did. But when we were actually mapping these expectations, we realized that some of them were applicable to specific touch points, but some of them were specific to the entire relationship. So, for example, payment, speedy payment is relevant to the I'm joining touch point. However, trust is relevant to the entire journey. So expectations also have to be overlaid at either a touch point or relationship level. Then we would typically take it to quantitative research. So the 25 expectations that have been derived from qual and qual to quant, we would then throw that into VOC. We would maybe a CSAT-based survey, however, using key metrics like NPS and CES. And it's all about substantiating the expectations that the customers have told you about. So we ask questions around the importance of those expectations and the performance of those expectations. And those 2 questions are absolutely essential in terms of creating our first empirically driven current state journey map, and I'll come on to that a little bit later. And there are other questions that you can work out as well, like repurchase intention for loyalty, a likelihood to churn, those sorts of things. Next of all, we would map what we call customer experience curves, which I'll show you in a second. But we would also do analysis, so maybe some sort of key driver analysis, typically doing correlation coefficients and that type of analysis in order to understand exactly what your key drivers are and what your brand differentiators are within your organization. So, an example of a customer experience curve. So when we asked it about the importance and performance of expectations, the bottom line is the performance of the business. So this is what the customer currently gets. And the ideal journey is what the customer expects. So this is the importance of those various different expectations. And what this enables us to do is identify the gaps between current performance and ideal performance across all the various different touch points in the journey. And by doing this empirical exercise, anything above the line is clearly within the wowing customers territory. But when we do this exercise, we're able to identify pain points, which is the lowest point of delivery or the worst point of delivery or the biggest gap between delivery and expectation. And it's also, we get moments of truth, which is where the customer's highest level of expectation is at. So this is scientifically showing us where our pain points and where our moments of truth are. Now, when we've done the business diagnostics, we may have already been able to identify those, but it's interesting to do these exercises in parallel, and then we can make sure that what we think the customer's pain points are and what the customers are telling us about their pain points match together. Next thing, promises and commitments. So very, very important when you're redesigning your customer experience to make sure that you develop promises and commitments. So we look at customer experience as being the gap between what customers expect and what they actually perceive that they get. Okay, so what they perceive that they get is delivered by the product, by the service, and by the channel experience. What they expect comes from previous experiences, but it also comes from marketing and branding activity, and that's important to remember. So by controlling product, service, and channel, but also controlling your marketing and branding messaging, you can manage the relationships on the experience on both sides of that of that equation. Customer promises and commitments. Here's an example of one that we did with a telecommunications company in the Middle East. But we would use those promises and commitments to do two things. First of all, we would use them so that when we are transforming product, service, and channel experience, we do that in the context of the promises and commitments. So if customers are telling us, look, trust is something that's really important, when we design our product, services, and channel experiences, we have to make sure that trust is embedded all the way through those new propositions. On the other hand, we would use the promises and commitments in order to reposition the brand. So if we are telling people through the branding and messaging, we're a company that you can trust, and then through the delivery of our new product, service, and channel experiences, customers are feeling trust, then there should be no gap between what we're promising and what we're actually delivering. So that's the importance of using promises and commitments. Designing the future customer journey. So many of you may have seen journey maps like this. Pretty pictures, very, very useful to try and understand what the future journey should actually look like. However, often there's a lot of detail that goes into it. I typically like a spreadsheet because you can build a lot of narrative into that, and the narrative is really what the most important part of it is. It's understanding the detail of what the future customer's experience needs to be like. But really what we're doing really is just a storytelling exercise, because as we said before, this is not just about the functional side of things, it's about the emotional side of things, and Morris is going to go into that in more detail in his presentation. So this is a typical spreadsheet future state customer journey map, and we would typically build then the visual representation of this afterwards. But when we're going through a workshop, this is typically the kind of things that we're looking at. Then finally, transformation. In order to close the gaps between existing and ideal journey, we would come up with a number of initiatives, and then we would utilize those initiatives to then close the gaps between current state and future state journeys, and we would do that in some kind of phased approach. So, overview of customer experience management. You start with your framework. You can do mystery shopping, business diagnostics, and VOC. Your VOC helps you understand your customers' expectations. Your customers' expectations and possibly your company values can help deliver what your customer promises are. Your your VOC, business diagnostics and mystery shopping, can be used to map your current state journey. And then you use your current state journey and your customer promises in order to design as context to designing what your future state journey mapping is. So future state journey mapping is more of a behavioral science led approach to designing ideal future state journeys. Customer promises are used then to reposition the brand, as I've already said, and the future state journey map helps you then enter into a phase of business transformation, maybe re-engineering your processes, etc., etc. And as a result of that, you should end up with new product, service, and channel propositions. And as long as your product, service, and channel propositions have been contextualized by your customer promises, and as long as your brand reflects your customer promises, then there should be no gap between what you actually deliver and what you're actually promising to deliver. So I hope I've not run over time. That was a very, very quick overview of the approach that we typically take when we map customer journeys. Those are my details if anybody ever wants to reach out to me and ask me any questions, but I will be hanging on at the end of the session. Over to you, John T.
Thank you very much for that, and certainly a lot of food for thought there, and certainly identifying the gaps between the actual customer expectations and their overall journey is certainly a very important thing to do. Before we jump to any tips, Rachel, there's obviously quite a strong role for some technology within the whole customer journey mapping process. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, there certainly is a strong role for it, and really it helps with that outside-in approach. So the quickest and most efficient way that you can bring in voice of the customer, obviously, is by automating a good amount of it through technology capture. And that can come in the form of feedback management, so in a very structured way. We were doing surveys with customers. It can come through live chat sessions when you've actually got a customer live on the website and you're trying to service them that way. Or it can come through social media, for example. Or if we've got the capability of doing it, you can do speech analytics within the contact center. The great benefit of bringing speech into this is the richness of those conversations. So you get the agent talking and asking questions of the customer, and the customer will often talk about more than one thing that's influencing her decision or that's troubling her journey. So being able to bring that into this, firstly, it helps you to really understand how to segment your personas if you're working on a persona basis. And then secondly, it helps you to qualify what you're doing all the way through that customer journey mapping. So certainly up front, at the very beginning, you'll make a certain amount of assumptions about how your customers feel, and then you will start to backtrack and build behind that the actual voice of the customer. And you may even use mystery shopping as a starting point, for example. But yes, so technology can have a really good, strong core to any customer journey mapping project.
Absolutely.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Rachel Lane. We've got another Rachel who's joining us today. We've got Call Centre Helper's own Rachel Boynton, who's been manning the chat room. Good afternoon to you, Rachel. What's been going on in the chat room?
Can't hear you, Rachel.
You may have to unmute.
Rachel in.
Hi. Sorry. Too many buttons to press. Right, so hopefully you can all hear me now. Ben said, as customer journeys are fairly new to many companies, would you consider designing these from a clean sheet of paper as existing processes have been designed around business regulations rather than become customer-centric? Ian, what would you suggest to Ben?
That's a really good question, Ben. It's a brave move if you're going to do it from a clean sheet of paper approach. And let me give you a quick example. When First Direct Bank first started out, they kicked off in 1989, but at the time they were owned by Midland Bank. And Midland Bank said, the guys who were setting up First Direct said, well, you know what, we want to start with a clean sheet of paper because we want to design a unique and fantastic experience. And obviously they were owned by Midland Bank before it became HSBC. And Midland Bank said, well, why would you do that? We've got all these systems that you could use. You could automatically employ these. And the First Direct guys went, no, we don't want to be hampered by existing technology, by existing processes. We want to start with a clean sheet of paper. They went through 2 years of arguments and discussions before eventually Midland Bank said, okay, you can start with a clean sheet of paper. That meant a lot more investment. That took a lot more faith to do that. However, we ended up with one of the, I think most people would agree that First Direct is widely recognized, certainly over the last 20, 25 years, as being one of the best banks in the world. If you've got existing processes, the challenge you've got is your existing processes reflect your existing customer journey. They're not the same thing. So your existing processes reflect your existing customer journey. If you do a future journey without mapping the current journey, you have no idea as to how big the gap is between what your customer's current experience is like, what their current customer journey is like, and what the ideal journey is like, because it's the gaps at each individual touch point that you need to understand so that you can start applying solutions as to how you close those gaps. So,
and
yes,
Rachel, I think we've also got some questions coming up on segments as well.
Okay, yeah. Hannah's asked, how do you incorporate your various segment groups? Rachel Lane, I wondered if you had any thoughts on this.
Yeah, and this is something that we talk about a lot, and this comes to the big question of how do you segment your customer data in a way that makes sense so that you can monitor it and manage it better within customer journeys. Now, a lot of organisations will use personas to help them do this. Many organisations will start off with traditional marketing segment groups, for example, and then quickly move away from that and find a better solution that works from them. And that might be either from looking at understanding their voice of customer that they're bringing in, or it's because they're building those personas out. And those personas they're still segments in some description, but there are segments that are really geared in groups that make sense with the lifestyle and the habits of the way those customers engage with that organisation, rather than segmented by age, by demographic, by geography. So, certainly from our perspective, we use personas very heavily within customer journey mapping. But I know, there's many other organisations out there that don't use personas. They will use a different methodology.
Okay, thank you. Stephen's asked, I'm interested in most effective approach in the identification of the moments of truth on the journey. Maurice, I don't know, any idea about the moments of truth?
Well, again, that's a very interesting journey, Stephen 21. I was talking to Stephen 20 the other day. No, sorry. The real challenge of moments of truth is that people do misunderstand them, and they do they misuse this term of moments of truth when they're actually doing their customer journey mapping. A moment of truth, so I was doing a project with a big bank, funnily enough, not First Direct, and yes, those arguments were huge. I often saw people come to blows on that particular project. But in terms of moments of truth, a great example of where people get it wrong was I was doing a project with one of the big 5 banks, and one of the moments of truth was we sent the mortgage offer to the clients. Now, actually, from the client's point of view, a moment of truth might be when they got the offer, but actually, it was when it was actually when they moved into the house. And what I would say the key short guidance that I would provide in terms of this, this is a question, is remember it's the customer's moment of truth, and it's the one that probably. It sort of leads into what I'm about to talk about in my little piece here, which is about the emotion. And what I would say is that an emotional moment of truth is when there is a measurable change to the emotional state of your customer, rather than a point in a business process. That's called a process gateway. And it's about the misuse of language, and be careful you don't get suckered into thinking moments of truth is a thing on a process map.
Okay, thank you very much. This one's a question for Ian, actually, based on your presentation. How do you arrive at the numbers which help identify the gap? What methods do you use? You clarified to say it was the link between expectation and perception.
Yes. So the previous steps that I spoke about in the presentation, we do the if at a very basic level, we do the journey framework in order to provide the framework. We do the qualitative research to understand what the customer's expectations are. We do the qual to quant to filter those expectations to a more manageable number, and then we put those expectations into quantitative research so we can substantiate the results, and we know how those expectations apply to each of the different stages of the journey. So all of that is empirically derived as directly off the back of VOC research. So journey framework, qual to quant, and analytics help you then have the data that you require to be able to map out those customer experience curves.
If I may, Rachel, we have a slightly different view on that, which I am going to come to in my presentation. But basically, what we would counsel anyone to do is to create a relatively simple statistical model, and I'm going to give an example of that in my presentation, and then to test that. And to marry that up with the actual observational piece of what your customers say and do, and more importantly, how they behave in relation to you as an organization. And then over time, what you actually arrive at is a robust set of metrics on which you can build these things. So start with a simple framework, because how angry is angry, how engaged is engaged. If you can't explain it, how the hell can you manage it? How the hell can you change it? So it's very important to use the most simple models you can. And we've seen huge improvements in terms of customer satisfaction, in terms of impact on the bottom line, simply by getting everyone to understand what everyone means by happy or unhappy customers. So I think it's quite an important point.
Yeah, certainly one I think we could almost do another webinar on how to measure all of those metrics. So Rachel Boynton, thank you very much for joining us. We'll be jumping back to you in the chat room later. We're going to do a quick poll now, and we're going to find out what you use to measure or to draw out your customer journey maps. Do you do it using Post-it notes, paper, or whiteboards? Do you use PowerPoint to do your customer journey maps? Do you use spreadsheets? Do you have some voice of the customer software that you use in that, or do you use some specialist customer mapping software to get the results to get your customer journey maps drawn? You can vote for more than one on these, so it'd be quite interesting to do. And certainly Post-it notes. I think I probably ought to buy shares in Post-it notes in 3M who make them, because I think if customer journey mapping takes off, there'll be an awful lot of Post-it notes being used. Let's have a look at the, and I think Ian showed a whole mass on the board on one of his presentations. Let's just put some of the results on here. 65% use manual methods, if you like, Post-it notes, paper or whiteboards. 51%, Ian, like you, use spreadsheets. I'd be very interested if anyone has a spreadsheet, if they could send one in, and perhaps we could make up a sort of an example template that people could use. 26% use PowerPoint, 16% specialist customer mapping software, and Rachel Lane, only 12% of people are using voice of the customer software in their journey maps. Do you think they're missing a trick or two there?
Well, I think that's a fairly complex technology solution that you're talking about in order to draw a customer journey map. So you've got technology that you're able to bring in that voice of the customer and analyze it. But when you're talking about the voice of customer software to map that, what you're talking about is being able to bring in that omni-channel journey together. So something like a Hadoop platform, for example. And many organisations aren't quite ready to do that yet. If you talk to many of them, it's certainly on their list of things that they want to do. But you know, a lot of them are still in the process of bringing the technology in to actually gather and then analyse. And really, this requirement is for a platform that sits on top of that. So I'm not surprised in that. I think, you know, we're not going to mature in terms of the voice of customer software that will design and manage that customer journey for you for probably another 24 months. It's available now, but it's quite a big ask for many organisations to be at that point today.
Excellent. So I think there's certainly some exciting things coming there, and I think the specialist software is also going to make a difference over time. Maurice, you've been looking at customer journeys for a while. Would you like to share some of your thoughts about bringing emotions into the customer journey?
So thank you, Jonty. Thank you, everybody. I'm conscious of the time, so I'm just going to try and take you through this relatively quickly. The slides will be available afterwards, and in fact, they are available through the foundation after the webinar today. So I just want to start out by talking about the change very quickly in terms of where we were in customer journey mapping. And it's only 40 months ago since the picture on the left represented the state of art in customer journey mapping. And the picture on the right is probably where a lot of people today would describe that as being advanced. And from our point of view as an organization, that represents kind of 2/3 of the picture of what a customer journey map ought to look like. And speaking to your point earlier, Jonty, I will share in a standard version of this with you after the webinar today. But from a practical point of view, one of the challenges is it's not just where you are in terms of if you've started mapping the journey or not. It's the fact that what maturity means is changing all the time. So, you know, what we consider to be good customer journey mapping a year ago now seems a little old hat, and that process is going to endlessly continue because customer expectations are changing. So I'm giving it a slightly closer look at this, and we look at a whole range of things from how complex an experience is to how appropriate it is, to what feelings it evokes, and a whole thing around time cadence and whether or not you're asking a question too soon or too late. But I just want to focus on two parts, really. One is the emotional state. That's my main theme today. And then the second one is actually, just briefly, I want to touch on a thing called customer work. And when I look at the work that we've done and the work that we're doing, and thinking about what Rachel had been saying, I wanted to make the point that behavioral science is now how we get the most out of the new technology that organizations like Brim produce, because the technology is amazing. It can do absolutely fantastic things, but I think the business science that gets us there and helps us to understand how to use it hasn't quite caught up. And there are things like self-direction, where we're doing so much more in terms of helping ourselves, that lead us to talk about one or two things. And the first one is this customer work, and this is a metric that we've been developing for a period of time, and it comes from a really simple premise, which is, did you know that Apple customers are doing more promotion and more support than the company? And if you think about the number of customers that Apple have, that's a huge workforce developing the promotion, developing the support services on behalf of the company. And of course, there is an organization called giffgaff in the mobile space who famously used to have or have 14 employees to service their customers. And the number of customers that you can get to work from you basically increases the ROI of every penny that you spend in your business. So customer work's a very interesting metric in terms of understanding how engaged or how involved your customers are. But then I just want to briefly give you a couple of examples about why emotional engagement is a good thing. And here's one from the Harvard Business Review about a bank, and what they said was the increase in the increase in emotional connection had a 70% impact on their segment and 40% increase in the number of accounts. And that's great, but I didn't really get that as a practical example. So here's a really clever thing from Kleenex. They found people complaining that they didn't feel well on Facebook, and they sent 50 of them little kits to make them feel better. That generated 650,000 impressions on Facebook and 1,800 interactions. And out of the 50 people who got sent the kits, 100% of them all posted positive comments about Kleenex online. It's a wonderful campaign and a great example. And we create experiences already, so if I have a problem, I go to the website and I can't find your number, but I still have to make a call. And then the IVR tells me about how good your organization is, and that I find really, really annoying. And then the IVR gives me options that I don't need while telling me that if I was clever, I'd be on the website. And what it's really saying is that's where the smart people are, and you're not very smart. Well, actually, I was on the website, and it didn't work. But then what you do is you make me wait for an agent and maybe make me listen to the same message time after time. And I know, Jonty, that's something that you could speak to more eloquently than I. And then finally, we speak to an agent who doesn't have enough information. So we create bad emotional experiences already. And my point is that we need to create better ones. So this is a journey that we did, and people can download this and look at it after the webinar. But basically, this is the insurance sales journey, and insurance is not a happy product to buy. But what we've designed there within this, and this was for a major insurer, was the idea that at various points where customers are nervous or unhappy or disengaged, that what we could do is we could build wow moments. And the impact of that on their bottom line, in terms of the way in which they've tested it so far, has been very encouraging. But let's have a look at emotions in a little more detail for a second. And again, I'm not going to cover this in a huge amount of detail. You're going to need to actually download this stuff and read it at your leisure. But what we have, as we do for most subjects, is we have a relatively simple scale, or it appears to be relatively simple. There's some complexity behind it, of -5 to 1 and +5 to 1 with a 0 in the middle. And the interesting thing about this scale is that there are a group of passive stages and a group states, my apologies, and a group of active states. And those active and passive states actually behave rather differently, and I just want to give you a very quick flavor before I hand back to the panel. So the reality is, for most products, for most organizations where we are not expecting people to be highly emotionally engaged, customers don't really care. They think you're the best of a bad bunch, or they think you're slightly better than the rest, but you know, they're not about to get a tattoo with your name on or your brand on, and they're not about to talk about you. And largely, slightly indifferent customers are the majority of people's customers. That's why they don't answer surveys. That's why they don't talk about your brand. And all of your marketing effort is not designed to move them forward from there. It's designed just to keep them in that state. And then there are people who perhaps, if pushed, will have a view about your product. But in general, they are still very disengaged people, and if forced to, they may answer a question. But the reliability of that answer is not necessarily as strong as you would like it to be. And then there are people who are actively engaged with your brand. And those people may engage in what we call customer work. They may talk about you at a party, but they're more likely to be a more passive nature of person, i.e. they're more likely to be introverts, So there's not just an emotional state of engagement, there's also a personality element to this, because these are the people who will talk about you if pressed, but actually aren't out there shouting about the big I am and the things that they think are important because they like to hear their own voices. And then there are the people who are extroverts. They are engaged, they have an opinion, and they will say an awful lot about your brand, be it good or be it bad. And then the final group is those people who are highly emotionally involved with your brand, for better or worse. These are the people who right now are causing the biggest ripples in terms of your social interaction. And these are the ones who could have the biggest positive or negative impact on your brand. But here's the thing, everybody. This is passion. And passion doesn't last. So whether or not someone is at the peak of desire because what they've done is they've just started to unwrap the box, or whether they are at the peak of hate because they have just experienced your worst customer experience, this is not a steady state. This is a peak of passion, and this is one of the reasons why, when talking about metrics, I talk about a basket of metrics, because if something like Net Promoter Score scores you at the point when you are at a peak, you get an inappropriate view. When you use the wonderful technology supplied by people like Verim, understanding the emotional state and understanding the heightened state of emotion allows you to take all of that fantastic insight and actually understand its value. So just to summarize, we already deliver emotional customer experiences. I haven't spent much time today talking about the bottom line, but in terms of delivering good ones over bad ones, I've seen cases where there's a 50% increase in profitability, and I've seen cases where there's been a 1% increase in profitability. But if you go online and look, you'll find a huge amount of good case study stuff about how emotional connections can impact the bottom line. If you just look at the gift gap model, you'll see effectively they run a very good business by getting the customers to do the work for them and by incentivizing them appropriately. Looking as I do around businesses around the world, and we operate in about 20 countries around the world currently, we see emotions as a huge differentiator and very cost-effective, more cost-effective than almost everything else you can spend money on, and a very good way of leading transformation in your organization. So, I would counsel you when you're building your customer journey maps, and I know a lot of you are at the beginning of this process, but just try to describe the emotions, because how angry is angry? If we can't express it, how can we change it? How can we improve it? And with that, again, I'd like to thank everybody for their time. There is our website details. There's my email as well. And of course, we're happy to answer questions. And with that, I think I hand you back to Jonty.
Thank you very much indeed for that, Morris. There's a lot of great food for thought, certainly in terms of detail that we've gone through in one webinar. We've probably got more than we've dealt with for a long time. And Rachel, we talked about some of the different ways that we can build, look at emotion. I'm guessing that things like speech analytics technology would help get to the disengaged customers who perhaps don't fill in the surveys. You got that bathtub effect, as I think Morris was alluding to. So you could actually listen to phone calls, call recordings, could get you insight from those silent customers.
Yeah, absolutely. And, by the words, those keywords and key phrases that the customers say, you can really better understand emotion. It's not quite as simple as just word spotting within speech analytics. It's all about what we call semantic intelligence. So it's actually, what's the customer saying before they're saying these keywords of things like disappointed, fed up, and what are they saying afterwards? Are they saying, I was fed up with my last supplier, but you're brilliant? So you know, if you're looking at speech analytics suppliers, make sure that you would choose a supplier that has that semantic intelligence, because applying emotion to customer journeys is actually a very difficult thing to do if you're building a journey from an inside out approach. So it does add superb value into that emotional piece that Morris was just talking about.
Wonderful.
If I could just add to that.
We've just reached the top of the hour, and I know a lot of people have got to dash off for other meetings. Our speakers today have agreed to keep the lines open for 10 minutes, and we'll be carrying on the discussion and answering other audience questions. But I would like to say, if you could leave your feedback, and hopefully we can get to the silent majority who hopefully weren't disengaged today, if you could leave your feedback in the chat room in 1 or 2 words. What did you like best about today's webinar? I'd just like to thank our speakers, Ian Williams from Jericho Consulting, Morris Pentle from the Customer Experience Foundation, Rachel Lane from Verint, and our speakers will be all online just for 10 minutes more at the end of the webinar. If you want to get a copy of the detail of today, and there's a lot of detail we've done in the slide, callcenterhelper.com/recorded webinar. So to anyone in the audience, thank you for joining us today. We're going to be back in 2 weeks, where we're going to be looking at building emotional intelligence into the contact center. So thank you for joining us. And if you have 10 minutes more, then we're going to jump across to the chat room now, and Rachel will be picking up on some of the questions from the audience. So Rachel, I don't know if we can get some of the questions up there. Sorry, Ian, I think we just cut you off on that last point.
I was just going to say about Rachel with the semantics. I agree 100% with that. One of the things that I didn't cover off in my rather lengthy presentation was around the VOC platforms, and clearly the Verint technology doesn't necessarily fall into what we would call a platform VOC, but it's technology nevertheless that helps you to guide and improve the customer experience. But semantics is very important. However, most providers who have semantic knowledge within their engines, it needs to be developed, or it needs to be enhanced for each individual organization, depending on the nature of their customers and the kind of language they use. So I've done some work with Confirma, and one of the things that they found quite regularly was that when they worked with a new customer, they had to build the semantic logic from ground up with every single customer that they work with. So you're not going to get perfect semantic intelligence from day one. However, if you build it up over time, which is quite a manual process to begin with, you can end up with a semantic logic which is directly relevant to your customer base.
I'd like to add something to that, actually. What Verint's platform does is really, it's tremendously useful on an industrial scale, and it helps you to stick large amounts of information into manageable buckets. But actually, there is a strong case of not just leaving it there, but actually, taking some of those insights and playing them in front of the board, and applying some behavioral science to this. With so many of these platforms, where I see the big failing in organizations is they use the platforms as though they were isolated silos of information, rather than blending them into the overall intelligence. And this is where I was saying, the platform providers do a fantastic job, but what we then do is expect the platforms to be as intelligent as people, and yet, if that was the case, we'd have robots.
Right. We've had a question in from Ben who said, with customer-centric measures, would you want to consider collecting voice of the customer data through contact center and end service surveys to establish failure demand calls around products and services, then using the data to establish key themes? Rachel, I wondered if you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, you would use it to establish all of the above, to be honest with you. So in terms of, I would say to organisations, don't just rely on surveys. So you'll get an average of around 5, or if you're quite close to your customers, a 10% response rate within those surveys. And often that's not even a statistically valid sample. So, and you will often get those customers that have an emotional state at that point. So if they've had an unsuccessful journey and then they're asked to complete a survey, then you've got a higher percentage of people that will fill in that survey, but it's going to be more negative than if you understand the broad core base within a contact centre. So yes, you can use it to establish failure demand, and importantly, you can use it to establish root cause analysis and what those root cause clusters are telling you. And equally though, you can use it to understand emerging themes and topics. So speech analytics will learn over a short period of time what an average day looks like in your contact centre, and then as soon as something starts to trend, customers are talking about something more often than they usually do, then speech analytics will emerge that as a gathering topic. So yes, you can use it on both sides of that, Rachel.
Okay, thank you.
If I may, Rachel, if I may, you can also use the call codes from within your contact center, and you can also use a whole range of other pieces in order to establish those failure demand things. It is about looking across across all of the rich insight that's available to you. I generally see that as one of the areas that most organizations fail, that they have all the information, they're just not looking at it.
Yeah, and can I add something to that as well? When I spoke about the business diagnostic approach that we go through, that's exactly the point that Maurice and Rachel have made. Looking at existing data within the organization to identify failure demand and value demand to understand where the business is going right and wrong. But interestingly, when you look for pain points from failure demand from existing business data, often 90% of the time it perfectly correlates with what your survey data is telling you from customers as well, as you might expect.
Okay. We've had a question in from Sarah who said, what's the best way to maintain customer brand loyalty when the brand completely changes, such as name change and those promises made by marketing are not necessarily in line with reality? Maurice, I guess you've got an opinion on this.
Well, customer loyalty is a really interesting term. I think it's the misuse of the term loyalty. But to give you a somewhat simplistic one-sentence answer, the question is, how do we demonstrate to our customers that we are loyal? And if you can answer that question and articulate it well to both your customers and your other stakeholders, then you're on the road to being able to get people to accept change. At the moment, most organizations see customer loyalty as code for spend more money with you and I'll charge you slightly less if you do.
I think that's very relevant advice there. Rachel, you've got a question, I believe, on a question from Ian that's just come in.
Yeah, Ian, Doris has asked, for a company that's not well equipped with resources to the business, that is struggling with key drivers such as customer service and network, how would you advise on how it can develop a customer journey?
That's a very good question. Well equipped with resources to the business. Well, if we look at the three different approaches that we spoke about, the business-led approach, the organizational-led approach, and the customer-led approach. The customer-led approach is interesting because if you're going to go down the VOC route, then you're either going to invest in research or you're going to invest in a VOC platform, which are expensive things to do. The point that Rachel made and the point that Maurice made very well before, which is looking at existing data and then analyzing that existing data, then through analysis of your existing data, you should easily be able to identify what the key drivers of customer behavior are. So what are the elements of your service? What are the things that you are doing that are driving churn, that are driving recommendation, that are driving lots of different types of customers' behavior? So often, if we work with an organization, before we go in there and say, say, look, you need to implement VOC, you need to do a big piece of research, the very first thing we do is we plow through their existing data and say, okay, what can we learn from the data that we already have? Or what can we learn from complaints data? What can we learn from call categorizations? What can we learn by running sentiment analysis across the existing business data? Because that might be enough to tell you what your key drivers of customer behavior are, in which case then there is no requirement to invest a lot of money within a big piece of research. However, one organization that we work with very, very recently, well, we're still actually working with them, we did an analysis of their existing business data, we did an analysis of their existing research, and it wasn't really telling them enough. They didn't know, and although they had reams and reams of data, it didn't really tell them enough about what the issues are. So they've decided to move to the next level up, which is then doing some research, and then the next level up from that, which is moving on to a platform VOC piece of work. So start with your existing data, see if you can analyze it, and get some sense from that. That might tell you what your key drivers are.
I think we're running a little short on time. There's two quick questions I wanted to get in before we break. Rachel, I think we've got one about local authorities, which I think is an interesting approach.
Yeah. Karen's sent through, what is the best way to justify change to an organisation with a captive market, e.g. a local authority? Prime example would be that if you're unhappy with the way your bins are collected, you can't change brands, provider, council unless you move house. Rachel, I don't know whether you've had any experience with this.
Yeah, and actually, surprisingly, early adopters of customer journey mapping were local authorities within our experience. We had a lot of them come to us because for them, it's not just about customer churn. For them, it's making sure that their residents are serviced well and serviced cheaply. And you can do the both together. So from that perspective, you know, local authorities are relatively, they were early to the game in this. And in terms of justifying change to an organisation with that captive market, I think one of the key learnings that local authorities have had through doing these voice of customer programs and customer journey mapping is really understanding what are their quick wins. So there'll be some issues that they know that they can't change, for example. There'll be some issues that will go on their long-term list, so things that enable them and move them towards smart cities, for example, where they're able to really understand what bins are being collected and when they're going to be collected and when the bin's full. That's all great, but unless you're in a city like Dubai, you know, you need to retrospectively invest millions to enable to do that. But you can have that on your future state list. What we're finding with local authorities is that they can really amass some quick wins very cheaply by really understanding, you know, what those customers are saying to them.
It helps identify how to save money is the answer to the question.
Yeah. And the other thing, sorry, just very, very quickly, with local authority that we did, the reason we were able to persuade them that they should do something like this is because the amount of time and money they had spent dealing with complaints from customers who weren't happy with the service that was being provided. By providing a better customer experience, it reduced the complaints, it reduced the cost to serve, and people were were happier. Say, for example, if their council tax went up, they were more happy to accept that change. There were fewer complaints by delivering a better experience. So it's all about making sure that the public within the local area understand that they're getting good value for money from the amount of money that they're spending in terms of their council tax.
And I think we've got one more question, Rachel, about lean thinking. So I think a very, very brief answer.
Assume that lean thinking Six Sigma helps with the logistics around service design, where journeys are emotionally focused. Is there a general agreement that these blend together well, Maurice? I don't know.
They do blend together well if they're used appropriately, but there is a huge difference between designing an experience and designing a process. You design the experience, you design the process, and then you marry them together. So the idea that you have certain things at certain stages in the journey, the customer journey, is not the same as you have them at different places in the process. Yeah, I appreciate the time, so I'll shut.
I would add one thing, slightly different from Morris's view. You design the experience, then you design the process to reflect the desired experience. You design the process to reflect the desired experience, but in terms of whether you're using Lean, Six Sigma to design that particular process, clearly it comes down to the individual who's applying that and whether they're customer focused when they're going through that. So as long as the Six Sigma person is customer focused and is using the customer journeys when they're redesigning their processes, then hopefully they will make sure the processes reflect the required journey.
Well, wonderful. Thank you guys for that. It's been absolutely wonderful. We've now reached the end of extra time. And so if you like, just put into the chat room in 1 or 2 words, what did you like best about today's webinar? And I'd just like to thank all of our speakers for joining us today and providing the wealth of information and experience they bring. Ian Williams from Jericho Consulting, thank you.
Thank you.
Morris Pentle from the Customer Experience Foundation, thank you to you.
Thank you. A pleasure as always, John, too.
And Rachel Lane from Variant, thank you for taking a journey to dial in from Dubai today. So thank you all, and we're going to be back in 2 weeks' time where we're going to be looking at building emotional intelligence into the contact center. Thanks everybody, and speak to you all soon. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.